Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really tricky part of criminal law, something that often feels, well, counterintuitive. It's a felony murder rule.
Hmm.
And we're not just looking at the straightforward cases, where a robber shoots someone during the crime.
Yeah.
We're digging into this core legal puzzle. When can a felon be held liable for murder if someone dies during their crime, but the death is actually caused by someone else, like the victim fighting back, or maybe the police?
That's exactly it. And this area, it demands real precision. Courts have to draw a very fine line, defining exactly what counts as murder committed in the perpetration of a felony.
Okay.
And that's where this idea, the agency theory, comes in. It acts as a critical limit. So our goal today is to really model that rigorous, step-by-step legal thinking courts use to figure out if that surviving felon is, in fact, guilty of murder.
It sounds like a huge legal tightrope, because in these specific situations, someone has tragically died, but the felon involved might actually walk away from a murder charge, legally speaking. Because the law demands this very strict, specific link to their actions, it can feel like a loophole, almost, but courts argue it's what the statutes require. Okay, let's try and unpack this.
So let's start with the basics. The general rule of felony murder, often just called FMR, it's essentially a tool jurisdictions use to impute malice.
Impute malice.
Yeah. When a killing happens during or while attempting a really dangerous felony, think robbery, arson, rape the law, sort of automatically assumes the mental state, the malice needed for a murder conviction.
Okay, so when you say it imputes the necessary malice, you're basically saying the law just gives them the murder intent by default, simply because they were committing that dangerous felony.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a substitute. It means the state doesn't have to separately prove premeditation or, even that conscious disregard for life kind of malice. The felony itself supplies it.
Okay. And why do states use this rule? It seems pretty powerful, almost like a blanket approach.
Well, the stated purpose, what the courts often say, is deterrence. Specifically, deterring felons from killing even negligently or accidentally during their crimes. The idea is to hold them strictly responsible for any killings they commit.
Okay, they commit. That sounds important.
It is important because that stated purpose leads directly to the key limitation, which is really the focus of our whole deep dive today, the agency requirement.
Right.
This is a limiting rule. It basically says the felony murder rule only applies if the felon or their accomplice actually commits the physical act of killing. They have to be the agent of the death.
So if they aren't the one who physically caused the death.
Then they're not the murderer under this specific rule.
Got it. That tension deterrence versus who actually did the killing sets up the conflict perfectly. We definitely need a case to see how this strict agency thing works in practice.
Absolutely.
Let's analyze that classic California case that really drew this line in the sand, People v. Washington from 1965.
Good choice. That's a landmark one.
Okay, let's analyze People v. Washington. First, what are the legally dispositive facts? Lay out what happened.
All right. In a nutshell, you have the defendant, James Washington, and his accomplice, named Ball. They try to rob a gas station owner, Johnny Carpenter.
Okay.
Ball points his revolver at Carpenter, but Carpenter reacts instantly, draws his own gun, and fires.
Oh, well, good.
Carpenter's shot hits and kills Ball, the accomplice. Then, as Washington tries to flee, Carpenter wounds him too. Washington gets arrested, and here's the kicker. He's convicted of first-degree murder for the death of his own accomplice, Ball.
Wait, let me get this straight. The victim shoots and kills one robber, the accomplice. And the surviving robber, Washington, gets convicted of murder for his partner's death.
That's exactly what happened at the trial level.
Okay, so what was the core legal issue the California Supreme Court had to decide?
The precise legal question was this. Can a robber be convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of their own accomplice when the fatal shot was actually fired by the victim who was resisting the robbery?
That puts the agency theory right in the crosshairs. So what rule of law did the court apply? Can you state the full black-letter rule and, crucially, break down its testable elements, especially that limiting part?
Sure. The court adopted and really strictly applied the agency theory of felony murder. The rule they use states, essentially, when a killing is not committed by a robber or by his accomplice, but by his victim, malice aforethought is not attributable to the robber. Why? Because the killing is not committed by him in the attempt to perpetrate the robbery.
Not committed by him, okay.
So the court's analysis, it naturally breaks down into two essential elements. Both have to be met for the felony murder rule to apply under this theory.
Element 1.
First, agency. Was the killing physically committed by the felon or their accomplice who actually performed the lethal act?
And Element 2.
Second, perpetration intent. Was the killing committed to perpetrate the felony? Meaning, was the act of killing done to further the common criminal goal, like the robbery?
Right, that dual requirement. Who did the physical act, and was it done for the crime? That seems like the real core of the agency theory. Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this step by step. How did the court apply the first element, agency?
Okay, agency. The court looked at the facts. The fatal shot, indisputably, was fired by Carpenter, the victim.
Right.
Carpenter wasn't a felon. He was resisting the crime. So the physical act of killing wasn't Washington's act, nor was it his accomplice Ball's act. It was done by an outsider to the felony, essentially.
So element 1 fails.
Correct. Because the killing was physically done by Carpenter, the agency element just wasn't met. The court said you couldn't impute malice to Washington through the felony murder rule because the killing wasn't his act in the required sense.
Understood. That seems pretty clear on a purely physical level. But hang on, what about the second element, perpetration intent? I get that the victim pulled the trigger, but couldn't you argue the death still resulted from the felony that had happened in the perpetration of it?
And that's exactly the distinction the court drills down on. This second element isn't just about timing or causation. It's about the purpose behind the killing act itself.
Okay.
The court reasoned that Carpenter shooting Ball wasn't an act to help the robbery. It was an act against the felony.
Right. It stopped it, for Ball at least.
Exactly. Carpenter's shot terminated the felony attempt regarding Ball. It didn't further their common criminal design. It actively defeated it. The court stressed that the statute requires the killing to be committed by the felon or accomplice for the purpose of the felony. It's not enough that the robbery was, a but-for cause or even approximate cause of the death. The killing act itself has to be in furtherance of the crime.
So the court is drawing a really sharp line here. A defensive act by a victim, even if provoked by the robbery, is fundamentally an act against the crime, not part of the crime for felony murder rule purposes.
That's the logic, yes.
Okay. And after analyzing both elements, agency failing and perpetration intent failing, what was the court's final conclusion?
The court reversed Washington's conviction for first-degree murder. Their strict interpretation, based squarely on this agency theory, meant Washington couldn't be held responsible under the felony murder rule for a killing committed by the victim, Carpenter. Even though factually everyone knows the robberies set the whole tragic chain of events in motion.
Wow. That reversal must have been pretty controversial. It feels so jarring, especially when you think about those earlier cases. The court itself mentioned cases like Harrison, Almeida, Podolsky.
Right.
In those cases, felons were convicted of murder even when the fatal shot came from someone else, like a policeman or an employee resisting. So what makes Washington so different, and why the sharp divergence?
Yeah, that's where you see the clash between different legal theories really come to a head. Washington, as we've seen, enforces the agency theory super strictly. It demands the felon or their accomplice be the actual physical shooter.
Okay.
But those other jurisdictions, the ones behind cases like Harrison or Almeida, they were often using a different approach, the proximate cause theory.
Proximate cause. Okay, so in those states, it was more like, look, you started this dangerous felony, you set the wheels in motion, so if someone dies as a direct result, even if it's the victim shooting back, that death is on you.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. Under proximate cause, if the death was a foreseeable risk or a direct consequence of the inherently dangerous felony you initiated, liability could attach. It didn't necessarily matter who pulled the trigger, as long as the death was closely linked to the felony itself.
The foreseeability was key there.
Right. And the Washington court explicitly rejected that. They fundamentally disagreed with using the felony murder rule to punish a felon based on what they called the fortuitous circumstance of how a victim might react. They felt that stretched the statute too far and wasn't legally sound.
The majority in Washington also seemed to push back hard against the idea that the main point of the felony murder rule is just to, deter robberies by piling on extra penalties if things go wrong. They found that arbitrary. But the dissent, Justice Burke, he strongly disagreed on the policy, right? What was his core argument?
Justice Burke had a very different take. He essentially argued the majority was giving felons advanced judicial absolution.
Strong words.
Yeah. His view was that the killing is a direct causal result of the dangerous situation the robbers created. By pulling out a gun, by initiating that violent confrontation, the felon lit the fuse. Burke felt they should be responsible for the explosion, regardless of whether their gun or the victim's gun actually caused the death. He believed the majority's ruling significantly weakened the deterrent power of the law.
That's a compelling point from a public safety perspective, isn't it? If robbers figure they won't get charged with murder if a victim or a cop shoots their partner, does that maybe make them a bit more willing to risk a shootout?
That's the fear the dissent raises. The majority, though, would counter that argument. They'd say, look, if the felon does commit a dangerous act themselves, like starting a gunfight, there are other ways to convict them of murder. We don't need to twist the felony murder rule based on the victim's reaction.
Okay, so that raises a crucial point. If Washington wasn't guilty under the felony murder rule because of the agency theory, what if he had shot first? The majority opinion mentioned that defendants who initiate gun battles might still be guilty of murder. What legal principle applies then if FMR is off the table?
Right. Even with the strict agency rule limiting FMR, a felon isn't necessarily off the hook for murder. They can still be convicted if they acted with what's called independent malice. This usually happens under a couple of alternative theories.
Like what?
Well, one is vicarious liability. If Washington's accomplice, Ball, had shot and killed Carpenter, Washington could potentially be liable for that murder based on conspiracy or aiding and abetting rules, depending on the specifics.
Okay, standard accomplice liability.
Exactly. But maybe more relevant here is implied malice.
Implied malice.
Yeah.
So if the felony murder shortcut doesn't apply, you just go back to proving the standard elements of murder.
Precisely. Implied malice exists if the defendant, Washington, in this scenario, intentionally commits acts that are inherently dangerous to human life, showing a conscious disregard for that life.
Like starting the gunfight.
Like initiating a gun battle, exactly. Or driving recklessly during a getaway, things like that. If you can infer malice from their base antisocial motive and their conscious disregard for life, then the felony murder rule actually becomes unnecessary. It's redundant. Standard murder law covers the person who acts with that kind of malice, even if their own bullet misses or they don't fire the fatal shot themselves. The agency rule just stops FMR from creating murder liability when there was no independent malice and the killing was physically done by a non-felon.
Okay, that distinction is vital. FMR is blocked by agency, but standard murder charges based on the felon's own malicious acts are still possible.
Correct.
Right, to really cement the difference between this agency theory and the broader proximate cause theory, let's use that extreme hypothetical the Washington majority brought up, the one that really highlights how far proximate cause could potentially stretch. Okay, picture this. Two guys rob a grocery store. They grab the cash and run out, splitting up, heading in opposite directions to escape.
Got it.
The store owner chases one of the robbers. He follows him for, say, several blocks, maybe even miles away. 20 minutes later, long after the robbery itself is over, the owner catches up and kills that first robber.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the second robber, who went the other way, maybe wasn't even armed, gets caught by the police almost immediately. He's already in custody, miles from where his partner is killed by the store owner.
That's a perfect, stark example. So how does this play out under the two theories?
You tell me. Apply the theories to that hypothetical.
All right. Under the pure proximate cause theory, that second robber, the one who was unarmed and already arrested miles away, could theoretically be convicted of first-degree murder for his partner's death.
Seriously. Even though he was in handcuffs miles away.
Potentially, yes. Because the argument would be, the original felony, the robbery, set in motion the chain of events that ultimately led to the death. It was the but-for cause, and maybe even arguably foreseeable that the owner might chase and violence could erupt.
Wow.
The Washington majority used this hypothetical precisely to show why they thought that result was, frankly, absurd. It demonstrates why they felt the strict agency rule is necessary. Under the agency rule, that second robber is clearly not guilty of murder. Why?
Because he wasn't the agent.
Exactly. The killing was committed by the store owner, a non-felon, long after the robbery was effectively over for the second guy and miles away. The agency rule limits liability to killings committed by the felons during the perpetration, ensuring punishment aligns with the defendant's own actions in furtherance of the crime.
That hypothetical really drives home the limiting power of the agency rule. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The basic rule, the agency limitation, the Washington analysis, alternative theories like proximate cause and implied malice. What does this all mean for someone trying to, analyze these situations quickly and accurately? Maybe for a law student facing an exam or just anyone trying to understand these cases, can we synthesize this into an actionable checklist?
Absolutely. Thinking like a lawyer here means having a structured approach. So when you're faced with a potential murder liability situation during a felony, here's a three-step diagnostic checklist. Step one, and this is crucial, identify the agent, the Washington test. Ask yourself plainly, was the killing physically committed by the felon or their accomplice? This is your first hurdle, the FMR choke point based on Washington.
Okay.
If the answer is why yes, the felon or accomplice pulled the trigger or delivered the fatal blow, then you proceed with the standard felony murder rule analysis. Was it during the perpetration of a qualifying inherently dangerous felony? If yes, FMR likely applies and liability exists.
But if the answer is and no,
If NO, meaning the death was caused by the victim, a police officer, or some other non-felon third party, then the agency rule blocks felony murder rule liability in a jurisdiction following Washington. You must stop the FMR analysis there and move to step two.
which is
Step two, check for alternative malice. Just because FMR is blocked doesn't mean the felon is home free. Ask, did the felon independently act with malice? Did they, for instance, initiate a gun battle or intentionally commit acts showing a conscious disregard for human life?
like our earlier example.
Exactly. If USAS, liability for murder might still exist, but is based on standard murder principles implied malice, maybe vicarious liability completely separate from the felony murder rule, you're looking for the defendant's own independent guilty mind or actions.
Got it. FMR blocked, but check for regular murder. What's step three?
Step three. Identify the victim and jurisdiction, the policy distinction. This is more of a contextual check. You need to note who was killed and what jurisdiction's law applies. Remember those proximate cause jurisdictions that reject the Washington agency rule?
Right, like the ones in Harrison or Alameda.
Yes. In those places, they might still find felony murder liability even if a non-felon fired the shot, especially if the person killed was an innocent bystander. They'd argue the death was a foreseeable consequence. But, and this is key for applying Washington in a jurisdiction following the agency rule, the felony murder analysis stops dead at step one if a non-felon was the killer, unless you find independent malice in step two.
That's an incredibly clear and useful framework. Identify the agent first, that's the Washington test. If it's not the felon, FMR is out, then check for independent malice. And be aware of the jurisdictional split.
Precisely.
So the big takeaway here really is that under the agency rule, liability isn't just about whether the robber caused the situation that led to the death. It hinges specifically on whether the robber or their partner was the physical agent of the killing, and if that killing act was done in furtherance of the crime.
That's the heart of it. And it leaves us with a final thought to chew on, circling back to that policy debate. If the law, by adopting the agency theory, like in Washington, removes murder liability in these specific scenarios, does that truly weaken deterrence, as Justice Burke worried? Does it give a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card for deaths caused by resistance? Or does it actually make the law more precise? Does it ensure that the severe penalty for murder is reserved for those whose own actions and intent meet the traditional definition, rather than relying on the unpredictable, sometimes tragic, fortuitous circumstance of how a victim chooses to defend themselves? It really forces us to think hard about where we draw that fundamental line between causing an event and being criminally responsible for murder.